There was never a school or movement of ordinary language philosophy as such. The term is a convenience for loosely identifying a group of philosophers whose individual views about how philosophy is best done had much in common, promoted by what they had learned from and agreed or disagreed with in the general background of philosophical endeavor of the first half of the 20th century, which had been shaped chiefly by Bertrand Russell, the logical positivists, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Just as Cambridge had been the epicenter of philosophy in the first decades of the century, and Vienna between the two world wars, so it happened that Oxford University assumed this role in the quarter century after 1945. In that place and in that period, the influential figures of Gilbert Ryle, John Austin, Richard Hare, and, though he disliked the label, ordinary language philosopher, Peter Strawson, were among the luminaries in a university town packed to the rafters with much philosophical talent, and to which, therefore, many who later became luminaries of philosophy in America, Australia, and elsewhere flocked as graduate students. Philosophically, Oxford for several decades after 1945 was as Paris had been to the clerks of medieval times. Those who merit inclusion under the ordinary language philosophy umbrella would largely share the following commitments about what philosophy is and does. They agreed that it is not science. Its problems are dealt with not by observation and experiment, but by careful clarification of concepts and by tracing the connections between them. Although they no longer nourished their predecessors' hopes that formal logic would serve as a perfect language in which to express and thereby solve philosophical problems, they shared their skepticism about metaphysics as the project of constructing grand theories about the nature of reality. And they thought about one good way to begin an investigation of concepts and their interconnections is to examine language, not merely for its own sake, as critics always alleged, but as a good and perhaps necessary starting point. As an evolution of analytic philosophy, this fairly standard view represents a shift away from the early analytic philosophers' over-ambitions for logic and correlatively the idea that philosophy would itself become part of science. That ambition for logic was an ambition for an ideal language in the sense of Leibniz's Characteristica Universalis, Russell's logically perfect language, or Carnap's formal calculus for the logical construction of the world. The aim in formulating an ideal language was to escape the danger of the misleading nature of ordinary language with its misrepresentations of how we think about the world. The more modest idea in ordinary language philosophy was that this same aim can be achieved not by translating into a formal idiom, which after all had been shown to be impracticable, but by dealing with the misrepresentations in language itself. But it did not go all the way to the view of the later Wittgenstein that all philosophical problems disappear upon observing normal everyday use of language. At most, the idea was that some problems would thus disappear, while others would become more tractable if one paid careful attention to distinctions and nuances in use and, if or were this different, meaning. Because of this later point, its ancestry in the more ambitious commitment to logical regimentation of language for formal analysis, analytic philosophy in the 20th century is often described as having taken a linguistic turn. And as these various approaches show, this is true. Examining language and the way it is used is our access to examining how we think, and our thought reveals what we take the world to be and why we think of it that way. In effect, therefore, you could say that an examination of our language is an examination of our world, the phenomenal reality we live in and talk about, leaving it to a further and different project, science, to formulate ways of thinking about what the world is, so to speak, nominally, the structure and properties of reality behind and beyond everyday experience. The two figures who are most paradigmatically ordinary language philosophers apart from Wittgenstein are Gilbert Ryle and John Austin. The differences between them in both style and interests illustrate the wide range of what can fall under the ordinary language philosophy label. Gilbert Ryle who was born in 1900 and died in 1976, passed his whole career, except for military service in the Second World War, at Oxford, where he became the doyen of the philosophical community, a kingmaker whose opinions about individuals could, without much further ado, establish them in academic careers. His influence in this respect was felt as far afield as Australia. He was a genial colleague, a lifelong bachelor, and like his younger contemporaries and protégés, A.J. Ayer and P.F. Strawson, he was a stylist as a philosophical writer, favoring a restrained and understated elegance of expression, which among some later Oxford philosophers evolved into what critics complain, with some justification, is a practically incomprehensible mannerism of involution and sophistication offered as subtlety. Critics say that this approach is too often aimed at little more than the hair-splitting of the scholastics, and its effect has been to make philosophy esoteric again, the preserve of an elect or of initiates, excluding many who might be interested in following and even contributing to debates about truth, meaning, mind, reason, knowledge, and the good. They have a point. The technical reaches of philosophy require precision and nuance. Achieving these without obscurantism is always welcome. Ryle saw philosophy as a form of conceptual geography. At the beginning of his most influential book, The Concept of Mind, published in 1949, he says, quote, "The book offers what may with reservations be described as a theory of mind, but it does not give new information about minds. We possess a wealth of information about minds, information which is neither derived from nor upset by the arguments of philosophers. The philosophical arguments which constitute this book are intended not to increase what we know about minds, but to rectify the logical geography of the knowledge which we already possess." End quote. We all use mental concepts with great felicity to help us understand and relate to others in the everyday transactions of life. But whereas it is one thing to know how to apply such concepts, it is another to understand their connections with each other and with non-mental concepts. Many people can talk sense with concepts but cannot talk sense about them. Ryle remarks, "They know their way about their own parish, but cannot construct or read a map of it." The cartographical metaphor is to be taken seriously. To determine the logical geography of concepts is to reveal the logic of the propositions in which they are wielded, that is to say, to show with what other propositions they are consistent and inconsistent, that what propositions follow from them, and from what propositions they follow. Note that Ryle talks, as Russell and the positivists had done, of revealing the logic of the propositions in which the concepts are wielded, but he does not mean by a paraphrase into the symbolism of logic, but instead by tracing connections. This was analytic philosophy's new sense of its logical task. It was a move from a more formal to a less formal conception of logic's role. Ryle's target in The Concept of Mind is Descartes' mind-body dualism, the thesis that there is mental substance and physical substance, and that they are essentially different. He called Descartes' dualism the myth of the ghost in the machine, and argued that it resulted from illegitimately transporting concepts that belong to one realm of discourse to another realm where they do not belong. The acceptance and employment of this myth about mind he called the official doctrine, because so many philosophers, psychologists, and other unquestioningly assumed its truth. Ryle gave the name category mistake to the all too common misapplication of concepts. One example he offers is this. Suppose a child is told he is going to see a march passed by an army division. Its battalions, batteries, and squadrons pass by and disappear, whereupon the child asks, "But where is the division?" As Ryle says, the march past was not a parade of battalions, batteries, squadrons, and a division. It was a parade of the battalions, batteries, and squadrons of a division. Likewise, Ryle imagines a foreigner taken to a cricket match and having the batsmen, fielders, and bowlers pointed out to him, who then asks, "But who is left to contribute the famous element of team spirit?" This, then, is the mistake on which the concept of mind as a substance distinct from body rests. There are mental powers, capacities, and dispositions, but there is not also and separately a thing, mind, made of mental stuff in addition to them. Moreover, the concepts of mind and body do not belong to the same logical category as each other, such that they are equal but opposite metaphysical partners. The concept of body belongs to the category in which other physical concepts such as space, color, movement, and weight apply, and where the subjects of predictions of color, weight, etc. are things. The concepts of mind belong to the category of what people and other animals do, such as remember, hope, desire, calculate, think, and of what they are disposed to do in given circumstances, such as feel pain when burned, desire a drink when dehydrated, and the like. Ryle argued that the typical mistake of thinking that when we refer to something there must be something referred to prevents us from seeing that when we refer to mental states and processes, we are not doing the same as when we refer to physical things. Indeed, he said, talk of mental phenomena is just shorthand for talk about behavior, a shorthand borrowed from the thing-referring language used for the physical world. The idea that talk of thoughts, intentions, and desires is shorthand for talk about behavior has come to be called logical behaviorism. Ryle did not repudiate the behaviorist label, though he thought a better name for his view might be phenomenology, because it is about what is manifest, what appears, is observable, when we use mentalistic vocabulary that pretends, as he sees it, to refer to entities or events hidden in private mental space. As this shows, logical behaviorism is a thesis about the meanings of concepts and terms, and is different from behaviorist theories in psychology, in which psychological states and processes are explored in terms of stimulus, response, learning, and reinforcement. But it shares with them, and the more closely with methodological behaviorism, the general view that the right method to employ in understanding talk of mental phenomena is to restrict attention to observations of behavior. The idea that mentalistic language is at very least explicated and perhaps made redundant by translation into behavior-describing terms. Ryle directs a supporting argument against what he calls the intellectualist legend, namely that the performance of an intelligent action by a person is preceded and directed by a conscious internal act of planning. His argument, known as Ryle's regress, is that this internal act, if it is intelligently directed as we suppose it to be, must therefore itself have been preceded by an internal intelligent act of planning. But if so, then in its turn, this planning must have been preceded, and so on. If for any operation to be intelligently executed, a prior theoretical operation had first to be performed and performed intelligently, it would be a logical impossibility for anyone ever to break into the circle. This argument has presented a challenge to all subsequent cognitivist theories postulating mental antecedents for rational behavior, such as anticipating, deciding, and the formulation of strategies. There is another point worth noting in passing. Ryle inconsistently claims, as noted, both that there is an official doctrine about the nature of mind, the doctrine accepted by so many philosophers, psychologists, and others who unquestioningly assume its truth, and that his doctrine is neither derived from nor upset by the arguments of philosophers. The point of his book is to demonstrate that Cartesian mind-body dualism, a philosophical view which has so misled so many, can be corrected by a philosophical examination of it, thus saving many from being misled by it. Either philosophy is consequential for good or ill, as Ryle demonstrates it is, or it changes nothing, as he claims it does. J.L. Austin, who lived from 1911 to 1960, must be distinguished from the 19th century jurisprudent John Austin, and his book Sense and Sensibilia must be distinguished as well from Jane Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility. The punning title of Austen's book has been fruitful in moments of tutorial comedy. It was published in the same year, in 1962, as his other book, How to Do Things with Words, both of them appearing posthumously. Like Ryle, J.L. Austin began as a classicist, but soon turned to philosophy. Apart from a distinguished period in military intelligence during the Second World War and visits to Harvard to give the William James Lectures in 1955 and to Berkeley in California in 1958, his career was passed wholly in Oxford. He published little in his lifetime, the most significant work being a translation of Freya's Grundlagen der Arithmetik in 1950. The first of the two books mentioned above was edited from his papers and prepared for publication by his colleague G. J. Warnock, the second by another colleague, J. O. Urmson. The William James lectures appeared as How to Do Things with Words, and the lectures Austin gave annually under the title Problems in Philosophy from 1947 onwards, constantly revised and embellished, were edited into Sense and Sensibilia. In these later lectures, Austin took as his stalking horse J. A. Ayer's second book, The Foundations of Empirical Knowledge, published in 1940, which expounds a phenomenalist view of knowledge and subjected it to a classic ordinary language attack. A.J. Ayer, one of this author's teachers at Oxford, was not proud of the Foundations of Empirical Knowledge, which he wrote in Caterham Barracks while undergoing officer training in the Welsh Guards in 1940, but he felt that Austin had not fully succeeded in demolishing phenomenalism, and in 1967 published an interesting response in the journal Synthes entitled Has Austin Refuted the Sense Datum Theory? At this, and the book's title suggested, the principal target of Austin's attention is perception. Austin had great influence in Oxford through the discussion group he held on Saturday mornings with colleagues. Although always courteous, he was a dominating figure. Some colleagues were scared of him. The Saturday meetings were informal and collegial in manner, but the unrelenting focus on what do you mean by blank shaped the content of debate, and through it the philosophical outlook prevalent in the Oxford of the day. An illustration of Austin's style of philosophizing is provided by the way he distinguishes between doing something by mistake and doing something by accident. Suppose you own a donkey, but one day conceive an intense dislike of it and decide to shoot it. You take your gun to the meadow where it grazes, take aim and fire. Suppose that at the very moment you do this, your donkey moves and you therefore hit and kill another donkey that was standing behind it. You have killed the second donkey by accident. But suppose it is evening. Your hatred for your donkey is whiskey-fueled. You take aim and fire at the wrong donkey. You have killed someone else's donkey by mistake. In Sense and Sensibilia, Austin defines the thesis he wished to examine as embodied in the claim that we never see or otherwise perceive or sense, or anyhow we never directly perceive or sense material objects or material things, but only sense data, or our own ideas, impressions, sense perceptions, percepts, and the like. And he says that his general response to this doctrine is that it is a typically scholastic view attributable first to an obsession with a few particular words, the uses of which are oversimplified, not really understood or carefully studied or correctly described, and second to an obsession with a few and nearly always the same half-studied facts. I say scholastic, but I might just as well have said philosophical. Oversimplification, schematization, and constant obsessive repetition of the same small range of examples are not only particular to this case, but far too common to be dismissed as an occasional weakness of philosophers. The deconstruction of the phenomenalist case is effected by showing that what it rests upon, the straight stick that looks bent in water, the indistinguishability of a genuine and a hallucinatory experience, is a series of mistakes about such locutions as looks like, seems, appears, and the distinctions between them. Consider the nuances of meaning differentiating the statements, he looks guilty, he appears guilty, he seems guilty. In the lectures, not in the published version, Austin used the example of encountering a pig. When we do so, we say, lo, a pig. Not, it looks like a pig, smells like a pig, sounds like a pig, therefore it is a pig. That is, we do not judge that we are confronted by a pig on the basis of sense data we are experiencing. Ayer's response was to agree that we judge straight off that it is a pig, but if asked to justify why we judge so, we can and would appeal to the evidence we have, principally the sensory evidence, what we saw and heard, the sensory impressions of vision and audition. Ayer charged Austin with himself not distinguishing between the psychological and logical order of events. Psychologically, the order is, lo, a pig. Logically, it is, I have this and that evidence, and that justifies the assertion that here is a pig. And Austin also fails to take seriously the fact that we can have such evidence and yet be wrong. Possession of pig-associated sensory data is consistent with the absence of a pig. That is the force of the skeptical challenge that an epistemological theory seeks to meet. The influence of the ideas in how to do things with words has been great, because in these lectures Austin introduced the concept of a performative in speech, locutions of the form I promise, I do thee wed, I wish it would rain, close the door, have you read Tolstoy? These are not statements of fact, such as that animal is a pig, and therefore they are not candidates for assessment as true or false, yet they are meaningful and important. The key point is that these utterances constitute the performance of actions, the actions of promising, marrying, commanding, and the like. To say I promise is to enter into an undertaking. To say I do thee wed in the appropriate circumstances is to marry someone. I wish it would rain expresses a desire. Close the door is a command. Have you read Tolstoy is a request for information. They are speech acts. Doing anything with language, whether making statements, often called statements constitutive utterances, or promising, commanding, asking, and so forth, are all locutionary acts. The very act of saying anything is an illocutionary act, the act of stating or asking or commanding, and relates to what kind of utterance it is, whether it has the force of a statement, an esoteric force, a question, interrogatory force, or command, imperatival force, and so on. The effect achieved by saying something is the perlocutionary act, the act of getting something to do something if we have issued a command, or the act of informing someone if we have made a true statement. In short, of bringing about a certain effect in an audience. These ideas promoted a fertile discussion, one of the notable outcomes being John Searle's book, Speech Acts, published in 1969. Austin sought to overcome the problems that vex the traditional correspondence theory of truth, the theory stating that a statement is true if it corresponds with the facts. The problem with this is, what are the elements of statements and of facts, and what is the relation of correspondence said to hold between them? Austin answered by saying that the correspondence relation consists of sets of conventions which govern the way we link what we say to what we are talking about. He specified two kinds of conventions: descriptive conventions that correlate words and sentences with types of situations in the world, and demonstrative conventions, ones that correlate statements or actual uses of sentences on specific occasions with currently occurring situations in the world. An objection by P.F. Strawson, who was born in 1919 and died in 2006, to this proposal is that it confuses two questions. How do we use the word true? And when are we right to describe a statement as true? The first question asks for an analysis of the part played by the predicate. Is true is in language, and the second asks for the conditions that have to be satisfied for is true to be correctly applied. If Austin's view were right, to say that a given statement is true would be either to say something about the meanings of words used to make the statement, or to say that the conventions are being properly applied. But we are not doing either of those things. Instead, we are agreeing with or confirming what the statement says. Austin's views and Strawson's response occurred in a debate between them at an Aristotelian Society conference in 1950. The debate itself is important for its part in the development of views of truth known as deflationary theories or minimalist theories, so called because they are aimed at denying that truth is a substantive property of things we say or believe, that is, a substantive property like correspondence or coherence, but instead, that talk of truth is talk of not very much. For example, nothing is added to an assertion of a statement by saying that it is true that that statement is true, is redundant. Hence, this version is a redundancy theory, or at most is true, just marks agreement or emphasis, which is Strawson's view. Or it is a shorthand device that saves repetition. Someone says, Everest is the highest mountain not just in the Himalayas, but in the world. And instead of repeating the whole sentence in order to show that we agree with it, we just say, that's true. But the Austin-Strawson debate about truth also exemplifies ordinary language philosophy, grappling with a question which is itself substantive and not merely quibbling with words, as some critics put it. Strawson might have disliked the label ordinary language philosophy, and indeed the label does not fit well with his later work, but what brought him into notice at the beginning of his Oxford career was the skillful attention to linguistic distinctions displayed in these disagreements with Austin over truth, and in the paper that made his name, On Referring, a critique of Bertrand Russell's theory of descriptions. On Referring appeared in the journal Mind in 1950, and its fundamental argument is that Russell's theory is an effort to solve a problem which would not arise in the first place if we were careful to distinguish expressions such as words and sentences from uses of expressions, from utterances of expressions. So again, he's saying that Russell's theory is an effort to solve a problem which would not arise in the first place if we were careful to distinguish expressions such as words and sentences from uses of expressions and from utterances and of expressions. Imagine the sentence, "The present king of France is wise," being uttered by different people in the reigns of different French kings. It is the same sentence each time, but the occasions of use are different each time. Different kings would be spoken of, and sometimes the sentence would be used to say something true and sometimes false. What can be said of whole sentences in this way can be said of phrases occurring in them, such as the description, "The present king of France." This phrase does not by itself refer to anything, but it can be used to refer to a king of France if there is one at present. Behind Russell's theory, one recalls, is the idea that meaning is denotation, and Russell circumvented the problems of this view by saying there are only two logically proper names, the demonstrative, this and that. Strawson opposing view is that referring is not something expressions do, it is something that people use them to do. It follows that the meaning of an expression cannot be identified with the object it is used on a particular occasion to refer to, and the meaning of a sentence cannot be identified with the assertion it is used on a particular occasion to make. Russell had confused the description with its use. The important point, said Strawson, is that the question whether the sentence is significant or not is quite independent of the question that can be raised about a particular use of it. It was natural for Strawson to generalize the views about language and usage that underlay his critiques of Austin and Russell, and he did so in his first book, titled An Introduction to Logical Theory, published in 1952. The book's aim is to distinguish between the grammar and syntax of ordinary language and the formal structures of logic, arguing that the former are not smoothly represented in or by the latter. This was accordingly a repudiation of the logicizing project of earlier analytic philosophy. In the course of the book, he introduced the idea of presupposition to explain the logical relationship between an assertion such as "the man in the garden is whistling" and the assertion "there is a man in the garden," which has to be true for the former sentence to be either true or false. A consequence of this idea is that in the case of presupposition failure, that is, where a presupposed sentence is false, a presupposing sentence falls into a truth value gap. Bivalence does not hold. This aspect of Strawson's views naturally, therefore, drew criticism. In 1959, Strawson published one of his two major works, Individuals, which had the subtitle, a somewhat provocative one given the general anti-metaphysical bias of analytic philosophy, an essay in descriptive metaphysics. He justified the subtitle in the introduction by distinguishing between the descriptive metaphysics of Aristotle and Kant, who examined concepts and categories, which in their most fundamental character changed not at all, and are hence structural features of our thought, and the revisionary metaphysics of such as Descartes, Leibniz, and Berkeley, who try to construct a better metaphysical picture of the world. Descriptive metaphysics is therefore conceptual analysis as practiced in the analytic philosophy, but with a greater generality, and its chief purpose, as in Ryle's cartography, is mapping the connections between concepts, not least to see which are most fundamental. Two key ideas in Individuals, again a work by Strawson, are first that what enables us to make identifying reference to things in the world turns on our taking the world to be a single spatio-temporal system, the items in which, the most fundamental ones being particular bodies, we are able to identify over time, and secondly, that most of what we refer to in the world, we do so under a description, not as a result of direct acquaintance with it, thus the same view as Russell's knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance, but with a major difference, that what descriptive knowledge must be traceable back to is not private data of sense, as in Russell, but items in a public world. The re-identification requirement offers a refutation of skepticism, for if we have to be able to re-identify objects in order for our thought and language to work, which they do only if they range over a unified spatio-temporal realm, then the fact that we succeed in re-identifying particulars shows that skeptical doubts about the perception-independent existence of things are groundless. Another form of skepticism about the existence of other minds is addressed by Strawson's argument that attributing psychological states to oneself, such as I feel pain and the like, turn on having learned the relevant language for doing so in a public context, so that the meaning of pain is the same when you apply it to yourself and to others. But this means that one cannot doubt the existence of other minds, for otherwise the acquisition of these terms would not be possible. Yet, another original contribution is the solution Strawson offers to the mind-body question, approaching it through an examination of what we are referring to when we use the pronoun I. He argues that its afferent is an entity to which constitutively two kinds of predicates both essentially belong, physical ones and mental ones. Physical predicates and mental predicates. This is a form of dual aspect theory of what constitutes a person, but its special interest lies in Strawson's claim that this concept of a person is primitive, such that trying to separate a person into physical and mental aspects is ontologically speaking a mistake. Strawson published his second major work, The Bounds of Sense, in 1966. It is an investigation of Kant's critique of pure reason, aimed at separating the valuable from the less valuable parts in it. Among the later, in Strawson's view, Kant's commitment to there being synthetic a priori judgments. By this time, the supposed hegemony, if there ever was such a thing, of ordinary language philosophy, in the sense most closely associated with Ryle and Austin, was over. Though among those who were still dazzled by the strong light of Wittgenstein, there remained a propensity to think that philosophy meant reading, discussing, and agreeing with Wittgenstein. This allure was still in force when Strawson wrote, but his work contributed to the maintenance of focus on a wider range of philosophy's problems. As noted, Strawson rejected the label ordinary language philosopher, and his Individuals work and his Bounds of Sense work well illustrate why. But in two respects, the particular interests and techniques most emphasized in this moment in philosophy played their part in other contributions he made. One is that he and his teacher, Paul Grice, wrote a response to Quine's attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction, arguing that Quine had set too far high a standard for clarification of the concepts required to explain analyticity, thus guaranteeing that it would fail, and that in any case when the concept is explicated in light of the family of concepts it belongs to, meaning, synonymy, logical possibility, and more, it is both a respectable and a useful one. The second respect is that throughout his life, Strawson remained interested in the question of reference and the difference between the grammar and logic of the subject-predicate distinction. It was an interest sparked by his thinking about Russell early in his career, and kept much alive by developments and theories of reference as interest in the philosophy of language, which burgeoned into analytic philosophy's chief preoccupation in the last third of the 20th century. At the same time, his discussions of reference continued to show the sensitivity to nuances of meaning that was the main tool of ordinary language philosophy.